Hello and welcome to the House Einstein Podcast. This is House Einstein Podcast 54. And in this podcast, we're going to be talking about a variety of things. But before we jump into that, let me introduce myself. I am Osman with House Einstein. I'm a founder of the brokerage, and I'm a real estate agent here in Boulder, Colorado.
I'm Hamish. I'm also a real estate agent here in Boulder, Colorado, but I support the team more than anything else at House Einstein and work closely with Osman, including this podcast.
And we've been away for a little while, so pardon the absence, but we are back. And in this particular podcast, we're going to be talking a lot about fire risk and climate change and how that might impact real estate here in Colorado. We've been away for a little while. We're super happy to be back. I think I already said that. A little bit different of a format today. I'm recording this from a different computer. So hopefully the sound and the video comes out well. Before we really jump into it, need to share our usual disclaimer, and that is this podcast, while it may seem to contain information about real estate, it's definitely not something that you should, make all of your
entertainment.
Make all of your decisions on. This podcast is entertainment, in other words. And yes, our attorneys make us say that, but that's so that you understand we are not your real estate agent. We are here to educate, inform, and entertain primarily, and all of your actions, whether it comes to financial or real estate or your love life, shouldn't be based on anything in this podcast. Call your real estate agent for real estate advice. And if you're looking for us, reach out to us at houseeinstein.com. If you're a past client or a current client, just pick up the phone and call us. That's the best way to get in touch with us and talk about your specific real estate situation.
Nailed it. It's
not really.
Well, we're a little rusty, right?
Not really. It's been like 6 weeks since we recorded a podcast. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the Carveout section, which is a new component of the podcast, a new topic area. But first, we'll cover the topics of telling you something perhaps you don't know, and that's on the increasing cost of home insurance in fire risk-prone areas and flood insurance, and perhaps some details about how that works out and might work out in the future. We're going to talk a little bit about market conditions, and in particular, the reaction of the market to rate decreases that began last week, the discount rate that the Fed announced. We'll touch base a little bit on some of our deals that we're working on. We call that segment Shameless Self-Promotion. And then sales of the week, we have several. I hope we can get through all of these in a reasonable amount of time, but all of them are educational, designed to illustrate price ranges and locations, and particularly how deals may have played out, including one of our own deals. We'll talk a little bit more about the news, and then this new piece that we have added this week, which we'll probably continue, but we'll see. This is the first time, is called Carveouts, where we touch base on things that may or may not be real estate related at all, and then we'll wrap it all up and put a pretty bow on it.
Beautiful. I think it's a good plan and good topic list for our first one back in a while.
That's right. And before we begin, we have a little word from our sponsor. This podcast is sponsored by House Einstein. We're a real estate brokerage based in Boulder, Colorado. Our market footprint covers Denver to Fort Collins and several mountain resort towns, including Breckenridge and Winter Park. Our goal at House Einstein is to help you make a smarter real estate decision. You can learn more at houseeinstein.com or our YouTube channel, where you'll find videos on neighborhoods, specific listings, and much, much more.
Awesome. Thank you, Osman, from the past.
All right, welcome back.
Well, topic du jour. I certainly didn't know this, and I'm kind of excited to discuss it a little bit more, but we met up with a home insurance, all insurance agent this morning, didn't we?
She covers a lot of different insurance products, primarily for individuals. I don't think she does commercial, but this topic has been growing in my mind and very present in my life for a while, both advising buyers and sellers on mountain property in particular, but also seeing the massive destruction that happened with the Marshall Fire, how much economic and personal lives were disrupted, and how that might continue to increase over time with climate change, with stronger storms, drier weather conditions, and wind-driven fire events like the Marshall Fire. And particularly as we continue to hear stories from our friends and our colleagues and our clients about increasing insurance premiums, or in some cases, insurance being canceled entirely. So this is something that is very in my mind, and has been increasing in my mind as a risk factor that buyers really need to think about, and sellers need to take into account with their strategies for how long they want to own property, or if they want to harden property. And so we were sort of lucky that an agent I have referred quite a bit of business to and that I trust has reached out to us and asked us to, schedule a meeting just to talk. And that was super helpful. We peppered her with questions for an hour, and came away with some new information that which might be useful for our listeners here on the podcast.
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway or kind of notable thing that I learned was that typical flood insurance does not cover flash floods. And in Colorado's climate, that's pretty much what you're looking at for floods. I think she said the definition for a flood by their insurance company was 2 acres of standing water. So you're kind of screwed if it's 1.8 acres or anything below that threshold. But
and if the water is not standing, it's flowing through, as was the case in 2013 here in Boulder. So Boulder is I've heard it said repeatedly that Boulder is the most flood risk city in the state of Colorado. And when you look at all the drainages that dump into downtown Boulder, you can kind of understand why. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but I've heard it said that repeatedly, that Boulder's flood risk is real, and that flood risk is primarily from a flash flood. It's from water hitting the mountains, dumping tons of water into the drainages, and then those drainages completely overrunning their banks. And I was here in 2013. It was horrifically bad, and also helped quite a bit with the cleanup in 2013 with friends and neighbors. So ever since, the topic of flood risk and flood insurance is something that is important to consider from a due diligence perspective, and things that we encourage our clients to consider. So what we learned is, what Hamish just shared, that flash floods aren't covered typically by flood insurance. So even if you bought flood insurance, you may not get your home covered in the event of a flood event. And typically FEMA is the flood insurance provider for the majority of products. They're the ones underwriting it. They're the ones behind the scene supporting it. And they're the ones with the flood maps, right? They're the ones that create the flood maps. But our agent friend suggested that there are other products that homeowners might want to consider if they feel their property is at risk of a flash flood. So that's certainly news. And the other thing that I thought was an interesting discussion was whether home insurance will simply be unavailable in the mountains, or is it just going to get more expensive? And her perspective is it's going to get a lot more expensive. My perspective is that yes, but at some point, some of these homes may be completely uninsurable. And I know that if I were underwriting and weren't subject to the regulatory environment, I would only want to underwrite homes that had fire suppression systems that were built to withstand or be resistant to a wildfire to some degree. Nothing is fully resistant, but certainly hardy board or stucco or concrete is going to be more resistant than wood paneling, and that hasn't been stained or updated in decades. And we see a lot of that up here in the mountains. We see homes that were built in the 70s, and not only do they have a completely different design aesthetic, but they are like tinder boxes. I mean, they're so dry, and they have they have normal composite shingle roofs. They have attic eaves that are potentially exposed to embers, and they have all sorts of dry vegetation around them, and the wood paneling that they're built from, I mean, you can almost look at it and it'll catch fire. So if I were, a private business insuring, I would not insure any of those homes because they are so at risk of fire versus homes that are much newer are a little more fire resistant, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you've not teamed up with, but you've had a few conversations with, I think, like wildfire partners or some locals. Is it an organization? How does that work?
Yeah, great questions. I was not prepared to talk about Wildfire Partners, but Boulder County does have an organization called Wildfire Partners, and they will come up and do a free assessment of wildfire risk at your home, and they will come up with a report that they recommend you then undertake their recommended actions, right? They will ask you to do all sorts of things for mitigation purposes, and if you do that, they will certify your home, which our home is certified, and we did the things they asked us to do to reduce the risk of wildfire, and that did help with insurability. So the first year we lived up here in the mountains in 4 Mile, our insurance was actually a lot higher, and then we found another carrier, and then that carrier canceled us, and we found a third carrier, and that's actually how we ended up with this particular agent, because she was willing to work hard to find coverage that was reasonable. So our cost to insure is actually about 60% of maybe 70% of what it was 3 years ago. It's dropped because we were stuck in a surplus line. Which is a specialty insurance product, and it's more expensive. So for sure, it's going to get more expensive. The question is whether it will have an impact on these asset valuations. And I think that it does to some degree. Like in looking at this week's sales of the week, there were a bunch in the mountains, and I was looking at that. I was like glad to see it that things are selling in the mountains. But mountain home sales definitely are a slower market, and buyers are increasingly aware of fire risk, as well as the difficulty of coming up and down the mountain to access your home in the winter. So those types of things are drags on the market, and increasing insurance costs will certainly be a drag. And she seemed pretty confident that there will always be an insurance product.
Yeah.
And I asked her to keep me in the loop on the state program, because there is a state program that was announced this summer. It just isn't clear how that state program, sort of the insurance of last resort, how that's going to play out into the market. So my thought process has been, okay, well, there's a timeline. And this comes from another one of our clients who's a climate scientist. And the concept is that, okay, at some point, we will reach the tipping point in the market for climate risk. And that could be 10 years from now. It could be 30 years from now. It could be even sooner. And in places across the country that are particularly exposed to wildfire, exposed to storm damage,
disaster, right? Yeah.
low-lying shore areas that are in the path of the hurricane, people are going to realize that that they need to move to places that are not going to be as impacted by climate change. So with that said, Hamish, you were just on the Northeast and in a place that looks like it's in the eye of the hurricane when it comes to climate change, right? On the coastal North Carolina.
Yeah.
And yet the market was on fire.
Yeah, so not in the projected track of Helen, or is it Helene, the most recent one? Helene.
Yep.
Not in that current projected track, but there was actually a tropical storm while I was there. And yeah, my brother lives out there and bought a home for $430, and just across the block they're selling new constructions for 1.2. And I mean, like, just across the block.
But they're moving pretty quick, right?
Yeah,
they
moving pretty
selling?
fast. And
Okay.
I mean, I saw my uncle out in South Dakota. That's where things are apparently moving even faster. But it's mostly anecdotal from them. They sent over a Zillow listing from some in-laws, and that got interest. It got cash, I think, and moved quick, which is interesting to hear. But I mean, I'm trying to think of what affects South Dakota. And maybe there's a corn blight that'll come, and I don't know if insurance would go up from that, but otherwise.
Well, over long periods of time, it probably has to do with just the livability of the environment. Like if it's so brutally hot and dry or brutally hot and humid, is it actually a livable environment? And in places like Colorado and throughout the West, there's a water issue.
Yeah.
And there are cities that are very much exposed to losing their water supply. And when they lose their water supply, there will likely be services that truck in water. There will likely be all sorts of large water container sales. That sort of thing will happen, but at the same time, the question will occur to lots of people: do I really want to live in a place that's brutally hot,
Yeah.
and has no water? It's like Tatooine in Star Wars. Like, do you really want to live in this horrifically unpleasant environment?
I'm not gonna live this down, but I've never seen Star Wars, so
It's a good thing this is not a hiring interview, Heyman.
yeah, right. I snuck in
this
under the radar
possible?
on that one.
How-
Snuck in on that.
How is this possible? Like, okay, we're gonna save this maybe for the Carveout segment.
Yeah.
Like,
While we're on the topic of water, though, just shout out to the Chimney Hollow Reservoir, and I think it's is it Larimer County or Lamar County, the northern county?
Larimer.
Yeah, Larimer County for putting a lot of effort into that and getting a huge reservoir kind of for the western slope.
Okay, well, that's another. Reservoirs are also controversial topics,
They
and I see
super
you
are.
changing the topic from Star Wars, but that's fine. Let's keep moving forward. So when that tipping point is reached, at that juncture, it's too late, right? At that point, the market moves into free fall in valuations, and I think this is a very long-term existential threat, not a short-term existential threat.
Yeah.
But as a buyer or a seller, how should you be thinking about climate change and the risk of wildfire and flood and the impact not just potentially on your life, which is frankly the most important impact, but also the impact on the asset value that you're now investing in, right? Most people are investing, it's the largest investment most individuals make in their lifetime, and this is what House Einstein is founded on, is advising people to be smart about this. And as a buyer, I would be looking at distance to the nearest fire station. I would also be looking at your escape routes in the event of a fire. I'd also be looking at the degree of forest around, the growth of the forest around the house. When was the last fire? Like the house we're in now, burnt. Like the house that was here burned. And so we're surrounded by burn scar, which in theory should help protect it. Although in a wind event like the Marshall Fire, nothing's going to stop homes from being completely destroyed. So those are the types of things you may want to think about when you're shopping for a home in the mountains. Do you want to put your family at risk? Do you feel like this is a real risk? And are you comfortable with being uncomfortable? So one of the things, it's easy to talk about, but when you are living in a home in the mountains and you see a smoke plume on the horizon and the wind direction is potentially going to shift in your direction, and it's now 10 o'clock at night, and you're watching the news and you're paying attention to Twitter or X, and you're hanging on every tweet, and you realize you can't sleep because you're not sure if you're going to have to evacuate you and your family in 3 hours, right? That sort of anxiety is very easy to say and a whole different thing to experience. It's uncomfortable. So I think if you're smart, you want to have that conversation with the other decision makers in your life before you decide you definitely want to live in the mountains. And for sure, the counter argument is, well, we've lost more homes in the Marshall Fire than probably we've lost in totality in the mountains in the last 2 decades. So really, like, are you sure
it
that
still pays to be prepared and consider it? But
maybe anywhere you should be prepared. So,
well, and I'll say, like, even down here on the MLS, there's this little field, right, which is like fire hydrant within 500 feet of the property, and so I mean it's taken into consideration down here. I think mountains just get maybe the media attention, and they also have the potential to burn many more thousands of acres. So I think there's a bit of a shock factor too.
Right. There's the density of homes can burn a lot more homes per acre than up in the mountains.
Yeah.
But the hardening factor, I think there's a great business opportunity for enterprising individuals to help homeowners harden their houses. Those cedar fences that everyone puts up in their properties are just conduits for fire. When in the middle of a
cedar loves to go.
Yeah, I mean, you just and now that people understand that, maybe there'll be more metal fence sales. Maybe there'll be fewer fences. It's something that is a real risk and is worth talking about with the other decision makers when you're buying a house. When you're selling a house, I think it's important to also think about getting it Wildfire Partners certified if you're here in Boulder County, doing all the wildfire mitigation before it comes up in the sale process, And also, if it's possible to do some hardening around the house when you're trading out that composite shingle roof, look into the cost of a metal roof. Look into how you might reduce the probability of embers entering your attic or entering underneath your house if you have a shed or something like that. There are all sorts of little things you can potentially do. And of course, keeping the grasses around the home trimmed to a very low level so that doesn't become how the house burns.
Yeah. I'm thinking back to our listing last year, Shady Hollow, and that house was almost entirely clad in metal. It was a newer build, and it's cool to see kind of that design incorporated into that for a mountain home. It still had that cabin feel and everything because it was kind of like this weathered metal, but it was a hardened tone. Yeah.
I mean, that was one of the key selling points of that house, and that was one of the reasons I felt like it was such a smart buy. So, as a seller, as you contemplate upgrades to the home, maintenance to the home, you may want to think about hardening it in preparation for a potential wildfire for your own safety, but also to help it be more marketable when you go to sell it. And you may want to think about a timeline to sell the home. You may also want to weigh carefully certain upgrades. Like, we were very close to pulling the trigger on solar in this house that we're in now, and the conclusion I reached, given the cost of solar, which was unreasonably high from the first bid, was that I could be overcapitalizing this asset. And it might make more sense because there's a really good chance we sell this house within the next 5 years. And I don't want to tell my neighbors that. Hopefully they don't listen to this podcast. I love them to pieces. But ultimately, it's a lot of house. It's 20 minutes from town, which adds a little bit of commute time for me. But also, it's a lot of capital invested in an asset at risk with a whole bunch of trade-offs. Like, there's spiritual trade-offs for being in the mountains. It is the sunrises, the sunsets, the lack of crazy neighbors that live right next to you. Like, there's all sorts of things that are really nice about living in the mountains.
Pros cons list for mountain homes. I mean, the pros list just goes on and on and on and on. It's really unfortunate, right, that this con is becoming such a front-facing big deal, you know?
It's worth having the conversation with the other decision makers in your life about your short and long-term strategies for both acquisition and disposition of these real estate assets. And you should be going into the purchase process with this conversation in mind. And you should be thinking about your exit with climate change and fire risk and flood risk also in mind. And not necessarily make your decision based on it, but it should be one data point or two data points to think about as you enjoy your living situation. But putting your head in the sand is not the answer.
No. Change is afoot. It's happening whether or not you like it.
Yeah.
I was going to say...
Go ahead. Well, I was going to say insurance costs have risen across the board. It's not just mountain homes.
Yeah.
We're seeing 40%.
I'm up $600 this year.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing 40% increases in some cases over the last couple of years because of the cost to actually rebuild.
Yeah, it's that segues pretty well. You're probably the very few person that has had their insurance costs decrease over the past 3 years.
That's only because we overpaid the first year.
Well, yeah, okay. Fair. But win's a win.
Yeah. And that agent is no longer my go-to that hooked us up with that policy because we really trusted her at that time to help us find a good deal, and we were under pressure because of the timeline of the contract and did not have that much time to shop around and shop agents. And so that's largely why our costs actually decreased.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'll need to shop around here in a little bit as well.
Yeah. So let's move ahead and we'll skip ahead from market conditions and move into a little bit of shameless self-promotion.
Perfect.
All right. First property, 1380 Knox Drive. This listing has been on the market a little bit, and it is stunning. One of the reasons we know that it's stunning is obviously not with just our own eyes and our own experience, but we undertake a very thorough approach to getting feedback from the agents that have shown the home. And I honestly don't know any other brokerage that does this. And I think I would see it because I would be getting these phone calls and text messages from other agents. And what we do is we reach out to every single buyer's agent that has shown the house, even if it's a preview, and ask them, what did you think about the house? What did you think about the price? Do you have any constructive suggestions for how we might improve its marketability? And if your buyer's interested, what might it take to put together a deal, right? That's the sales component of the feedback process. I would say it's 75% soliciting honest feedback and 25% sales in terms of trying to bring together a deal, right?
Yeah.
And this last week, we updated our feedback process for 1380 Knox. And at this point, we have all but one agent of the showings we've had has given us feedback. And the majority of that feedback has been very positive.
The return rate has been surprisingly good for this listing. Yeah.
They appreciate the views. The views absolutely are stunning. Some of the agents know the builder and understand the quality that went into constructing this home, the attention to detail that went into constructing this home, and it's quite evident to them. Others have no idea, and they're new agents, or they don't know much about the rebuild process, so they're sort of like, how do we understand this? Like, the price seems a little high, to which the answer has been, you need to go talk to a builder. Go meet with an architect and talk to a builder and get back to me on what you think the price should be after you realize that it takes 2 to 3 years to build this house. And
they used Trad Design, right?
They used Trad. And Trad did a great job. The home is stunning. And that feedback's really helpful to see, because when you're just sitting there in the dark as a seller and you're relying on your agent to give you feedback, well, your agent, first of all, could be just full of it, honestly. There are some agents that will just make up things.
Yeah.
They just make up things all the time. I've seen this sometimes in negotiation, where we've sent over an offer or a counter or a counter to a counter, and the reaction is they're just never going to accept that. I'm like, okay, can you actually ask them? like
you still have to show them.
You verbally ask where our number is going to be. In theory, they're supposed to show it, but before you say hard no, they're never going to accept that. In office, this is around inspection issues. Can you actually talk to them? Like, they position it as if they know exactly what their client's going to say. And I would say maybe 30% of the time agents do this. And more than 50% of the time, the seller is negotiable.
Yeah.
If you come back to them with a reasonable response, and here's why this number is what it is, or here's why we want you to replace the roof, or credit us for the roof, or credit us 50% of the roof, you'd be surprised that they actually are willing to talk. But their agent's the one that's like positioning it as it's never going to happen.
Yeah, some agents take a lot of liberties, and I think sometimes it's better if they just transfer over the offer or the conversation.
Yeah. But this feedback report is unvarnished. And sometimes it's direct copy paste from a text message. So
with
we're texting,
all the errors,
including sometimes I correct the spelling errors because
sometimes I do too. Yeah,
because I just can't handle the like they mess up quite and quiet, and
that one's so common.
I just know I'm gonna fix typos and spelling errors, but I'm not gonna fix it if they're either end. If there's superlatives about the house, they're super thrilled with the view, that's going to be in there. If they think the place is a dump, that's going to be in there. What a horrible house, it was dirty. That's going to be quoted in the actual feedback report. And the reason we're doing that is it's not that we can't see it with our own eyes. It's because, one, sometimes we miss things, and two, sometimes sellers need to hear it from a variety of potential buyer's agents to get the message that your listing might be overpriced, or your listing, has an issue that we could potentially overcome. And we told you, but now we're telling you again through the words of 12 different agents that are giving you basically the same message. So I'm bringing that up because...
And that's not to say it's the case as well.
That's not necessarily... Yeah. That's not the case.
But it can be helpful for that.
This is an amazing house, but I'm bringing up the feedback report because it's so thorough. Like, it's... Of all the showings, there's just one agent, and I'm not going to name this person, even though I think of him as a friend.
I'm going to look at
who has failed to respond to voice messages and texts. We don't shame by name.
Aw, yeah.
You're looking at it. Yeah. I know. I'm like, dude, like your photo is in front of the house on your social media. Like you had enough time to make a social media post with our listing, which you
Come
didn't
on.
ask permission for, but that's fine. And you didn't have time to respond to a text or an email or a phone call.
The optimist in me says that, he's working on an offer with his buyers, and, they're strategizing, and they'll come back when they're ready to talk details.
So that is 100% a possibility. And I thought about that too, because it's actually out of character for this agent to not be responsive. So amazing house. It is absolutely worth seeing. And the view and the location is really unique and rare in South Boulder. So go check it out. If you don't have an agent to show it to you, give me a call. I am more than happy to schedule a showing for you. And we're probably going to start doing regular open houses because of some of the changes in the market. So be on the lookout for another open house. You're certainly welcome to stop at that time.
Yeah.
All right, let me mention another
say hi.
listing that is worth talking about. And actually 2 more listings that are worth talking about.
Yes.
Telluride Circle is the first one. Now this one's not officially on the market yet. I'm not going to give you the address. And I think it will be on the market by the time it will be very close to being on market by the time you hear this podcast. And I'm not giving you the full story on what it is. Consider this a teaser, but it's an exceptional 3-bedroom, 2-bath in Shanahan Ridge that has been very well taken care of and updated. It's top 10%. And I've seen Shanahan Ridge listings, townhomes up there for over 20 years. And I can confidently say top 10%. And I can probably say top 5%. It has what buyers are looking for. And so there's one competitor on the market. I think that's priced in the high 8s. So we'll probably be priced either north or slightly south of that number. We need to see the competitor in person to make sure that this makes sense. So that's one of the things we do is price. You have to price to the competition. You can't just price because you think it's worth something. Or even if your appraisal says it's worth whatever number, you have to be in line with the comparables in the active competitor, sorry.
It needs to make sense in relation to the market that it's in.
I mean, buyers aren't idiots, and it doesn't matter what the appraisal says. If there's a better house for a lower price, they're going for it. And so you have to be priced appropriately to the competition, period. And not just the first week, but week after week after week, which is also something we do for our sellers, is double check the competitive landscape on a regular basis to make sure we're positioned properly. And that brings us to our last shameless self-promotion, 605 Alpine. This property has been on the market a little while, and we have almost greenlit a whole bunch of improvements. So we're going to be taking a look at this property. The price has come down to a very reasonable number. This is perfect for somebody that values a north-south facing lot, which, hint, hint, you should. South-facing homes get far better light, and you can build out larger because of the shadows. The shadows are smaller, which doesn't apply to every city in the country, but definitely applies to Boulder, because here in Boulder, we protect your neighbor's solar access. So north-south oriented lots can build larger, and this home is unlikely to have historic issues because of the age of the home. It also has lots of updates inside already that make it super livable. It's very close to North Boulder Park. And I think the only thing that's been inhibiting the sale price...
It's right next to Ideal Marketplace too.
It's also walking distance, strolling distance, rolling distance, hopping and skipping distance to Ideal Market. And I'm mentioning all those just to make sure we're inclusive from a fair housing perspective. Walk, drag, crawl yourself over there. You can easily get to Alpine Market. Thank you, Hamish. It's and Encinitas. Look, it's a great property. The only thing that's been inhibiting the sale, honestly, is the rate environment. And that's because I think the type of buyer that is looking for this type of property is looking for the future, right? Like the home itself is lovely, but the layout's a little funky inside. And it's sort of one of these things where you're like, okay, the layout's fine. I can deal with it for a few years. But ultimately, I'm going to want to pop that top, and I'm going to want to like completely reconfigure it, have a 2-story modern home in this location. And the lot alone, we are approaching lot value. We're getting there on the list price. And the house is actually quite livable as it is now with all these updates.
And it's dang efficient. Yeah.
But the sellers have agreed, let's make some cosmetic improvements. So rather than just pull it off the market, we're going to be looking at refinishing floors, redoing the lighting in the basement. So there's a whole bunch of things that are about to happen to this listing. And if you're interested in it, now's the time. Sellers are open to offers, would love to sell this home, but they're not going to desperately give it away. That's not their MO, and it's a fantastic asset. It's just the rate environment for for remodels and additions, architecture billings. That market has been hit really hard with the rate environment. So as rates start to drop, I think that this property is going to attract a buyer pretty soon.
I think
So
you're
that's
dead on.
605 Alpine.
Yeah. All right. How are we wanting to do this? Are we going to do market conditions next or jump into the sales of the week?
I think we're going to tuck market conditions into the rate cut discussion that was in the news.
In the news? Okay,
because we have some data there that I want to share. So let's hit sales of the week, and then we'll do in the news, and then we'll wrap up with carve-outs.
Awesome. All right. Jumping over to the sales. Are we starting highest price to lowest?
We are. And you can leave that segment, that little topic right in there. I think it's fine to tell our listeners where we are in our little table of contents.
Yeah, we are. Go ahead.
We're not going to, no need to cut that out.
Oh, I won't.
And good reminder for me to move a little faster, huh?
No, I think we're good enough on time. Maybe a little bit. We'll see how talking about these listings goes. It's always fun to do that. So.
Well, I emailed these listings to you, Hamish. Did you get a chance to look at them before the
No,
podcast?
I haven't. I wanted to come in fresh. So I have them in front of me, but I haven't dug through them.
All right. Well, let's rip through them. So the first one's 750 Cascade Ave. And this property, which was built in 1925, was listed on August 14th. It was on the market for less than a week. It was listed for 4.45, and it sold on September 10th. It closed for 4.38. So not a big discount. Let's do the math really quick, because we always want to know how these listings play out. So 4.38 over 4.45 minus the 1, only 1.6% below list, which typically in this price range, it's not uncommon to see 5 to 7% below list. So this home attracted strong interest and a buyer that recognized its value and moved pretty quickly. It was a cash deal, as they typically are at this price point. Buy-side office, I've never heard of. Sell-side office, I know pretty well. I know the agents involved. And the listing itself, let's see how long they owned it. We're going to try to cover this I know I'm going deeper instead of more shallow.
Right.
I'm always curious, what did these people pay for this house? How long did they own it for? It appears to be that it was in a family trust for a really long time, back into the 80s. So the digital record only goes to 83, and it's the same family name all the way until this new buyer acquired it on September 10th. So this is not atypical. Homes like this don't tend to trade very often. And if they trade, sometimes they trade off market, but typically they don't. To get maximum value, it's smarter to put it on the MLS. And this home is just classic. When you look at the design of its architecture, it's timeless. And they did a great job with exposing wood beams inside to give it a warm look. And even though there are some things that probably could use an update, that kitchen is looking very 90s, early 2000s.
Copper fume hood.
Yeah, giant hood, and lots of natural wood. And, natural wood's coming back, but some of this looks like walnut from the 80s, like the steps and some of the doors. There's some kind of quirkiness, there's an elevator, first of all. That's really unusual and lovely to have an elevator. There's lots of people that need that in their lives. It's got little pocket views of the flat irons. It's just a very, yes, there's dated elements. I would want to tear out that kitchen. I'd want to tear out the bathrooms, particularly the one with the gold trim. And at this price point, that is, you could argue this should have already been done. The primary bath was done and looks great. The outdoor areas look great, very well tended, the outdoor entertaining areas. So this is all turnkey. Well, it's not quite turnkey. Go ahead.
I'll say it's one of those things where because it's classic in its design, it's kind of got that timeless nature to it. Like there's definitely things that need to be updated, and that wood grain especially is getting pretty on there. Same with the windows in that one bedroom, or not windows, but the closet with the mirrors on the back of them. But it's from what I can tell, a very functional layout, and also a very attractive kind of timeless design in it. It's a homey home.
I mean, I can't agree with you more. And in my mind, there's sort of different categories of house design. I love a modern house, but typically modern homes do not hold their value or appreciate as well as a historic home that has classic architecture and has been updated to be more livable on the inside. And this particular home is a 2-story with all the bedrooms, most of the bedrooms on the upper level, one on the main. It has a 2-car garage. It has a larger than typical lot, almost 12,000 square feet. And the house itself is 4,700 total, which is a very generous size for the Boulder Market. It's not at the top end of the size range. Like, it's not ostentatiously large, but it's reasonable for most families and buyers in this price class. And the location is, I mean, I've been saying this is one of my favorite spots.
Forever,
right?
Yeah.
Rose Hill, 8th Street, 8th and Cascade. You're a block away from Chautauqua. You may have a few parking issues because people are going to try to park on the street, but in my mind, it's hard to get better than this. You're not going to see a lot of crime from those that are living in our drainages or on bike paths. The downtown type crime is super uncommon in this location. So, it's a pretty solid investment play on the market only a few days before an offer was locked down, closed in 21 days later, and no disclosed concessions. So if you know what you want, you don't nickel and dime over dumb things, and that looks like the case here. They got the deal done. So Cascade, 750 Cascade, great buy. Great sell, too. I mean, you could argue I'd want to see 5 to 7% below list, but not on a brand new listing, and not on one that hasn't been on the market in many decades, and not on one that checks all of these boxes. Don't be foolish to try to, you can get the house you want, or you can try to negotiate and get a good deal, but pretty rare will you get both. So excellent play. All right, let's move on.
Yep.
2332 20th Street. So the neighborhood in this case is Whittier, and the home was constructed in 2013. It had been listed in June for 2.5, and there were no changes in price all the way till it went under contract in late August, and it sold for 2.345. So $160,000, $150,000 below list price, which, let's do the math. All right, people need a scoreboard of some kind, right? 2.345 over 2.495. I messed it up. 2.345 over 2.495 minus 1. So you're looking at a 6% discount, which is much more typical for the upper end of the market. This isn't quite fully at the high end, but home that had been on the market for 3 months, 6% discount, not atypical. And this home, not historic, but looks classic in its design. I mean, it looks like it could have been, right off of Nantucket, very Cape Cod kind of style house.
It does, yeah.
3,700 square feet, classic 2-story design with most of the bedrooms on the upper, one in the basement. And the thing I'm not crazy about is that it's right on it's right on the corner of 20th, and it's going to get street exposure from 20th. 20th gets a lot of traffic north-south. I mean, it's not Broadway, but it's going to get a decent amount of traffic. So not crazy about that from a design perspective. But overall, I mean, 2013 vintage means that things are updated, energy efficient, and throughout the house, it's fairly turnkey. Like, there's really no arguments in terms of its design and its updates. It's perfectly livable. It looks historic on the outside, and all the finishes inside are not over the top, and they're all very tasteful for the design of the house. It doesn't have a ton of outdoor space. It appears to be kind of limited on that front, but not horrible. I mean, the lot size is a little tiny, 4,000 square feet, but you're downtown.
Yeah, and I think it's just an aesthetically pleasing home, too. right? Like there's nothing really looks out of place. It all looks relatively cohesive. That main floor hardwood color I really, really like. It's busy, but I have to wonder how much of that is, the camera and some upped contrast.
Oh, you
but
mean
it's a
kind of the layered look of different stain colors?
Yeah, I quite like that.
Yeah, me too. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I mean, huge open spaces that are also nicely kind of separated from each other. So it's that open layout, but not a, echoey room. It's a nice place.
Yeah. I'm not a huge fan of upper level decks.
No.
Currently owning a house with one. I get why they're put there. That they can create some space that otherwise wouldn't have existed, but they typically get used almost never.
I wonder about that. Hey, can you can confirm that you don't use it that much?
I mean, my wife goes out on the deck sometimes and reads a book, but I feel like it's 3 times a year. And then she'll leave a chair out there.
And the chair just rots in the sun.
And the chair gets blown around by the wind in the mountains.
Yeah.
I hope she doesn't listen to this podcast and hear me complaining about it. I'm not complaining, honey. I'm just noticing, that's the pattern.
This is just our experience with these outdoor balconies.
I mean, look, that's, I guess, kind of a quibble in terms of its design.
Yeah.
Like, most people like those outdoor decks, even though they add so little real value. But they do add, real value in terms of, livability. People do pay more for a little upper level deck.
Mm-hmm. And maybe they're paying for the dream that one day they'll use it, They see it when they're in the showing and they're like, oh, I'd definitely live that lifestyle.
$626 a square foot. No garage. That's the big deficit about this house.
Oh.
You're stuck with street parking.
It says 2 garage spaces.
It says 2 car off street.
Yeah, it does. Yep.
That means no garage. That means you can park in front of the house, but so can some guy with an RV built in the 80s.
Yeah. Not even on the property parking that's a rough sell. I take it back.
Off street. Okay. Oh, no, off street is on the property. Sorry, my bad. It doesn't say 2 car street parking. 2 car off street.
As you can tell, we're just getting back to the podcast.
Yeah, my bad.
You're fine. I got it wrong too. All right.
Okay. Let's move on. This one we're going to cover a little faster, and it's less of a happy story from a sale perspective. 3918 Orchard Court. So this property is west of Broadway. You could sort of argue it's Wonderland Hills for sure, but it's not your typical sort of large estate in Wonderland Hills. It's a smaller house, 2,400 square feet, built in the 70s. Had some updates. It's a 4-level home, so multi-level homes are often not quite as in demand as the 2 stories. But the lot itself has great space. If you look at it, I wouldn't say that they did the best job of landscaping it, but there's lots of private space in that backyard. Mm-hmm. And the overall aesthetic of the house is pretty nice, except for all that sort of old stone fireplace that has been out for decades. No one's really into.
And the older carpet that's kind of throughout it a little bit too. More the carpet in the loft. But yeah, carpet's an easy one.
Carpet's so easy and so dumb to not address. I'm sorry. Carpet is cheap and people get so emotionally triggered by dirty carpet, and you literally see dirt stains in the photos. So
Hard truth with Osman Parvez.
What's that?
The hard truth with Osman Parvez.
Look, people don't hire me to bullshit them, and you don't even need to beep that out. This is not a children's podcast. People hire us to tell them the truth, and it would have cost so little to replace these carpets, and for some reason, they decided that stained carpets in the lower level was fine. But overall, the house itself is not a bad house. It probably would have behooved them to do something other than the River Rock interior finish around the fireplace. There's things you can do to get that out if it's not a giant wall. There is a wall that looks like a sunroom that probably would have been harder to remove that from. But there are things you can do, right?
Right.
Kitchen is dated. Still, the location's pretty special. All right, so let's talk about the deal. This property was listed in April at 1.55, and it was coming soon for a few days, then went active, And after 2 months, they cut the price by 55,000. So in June, they cut the price 55, which was not enough, but at least it got them below the 1.5 threshold. And then 3 weeks later, they cut the price again, this time to 1.45, which is where they probably should have cut it originally. And then the end of July, it came off of the market, was withdrawn, and it was in withdrawn status for the entire month of August, and then expired at the end of August. So here's my first question. Did the agent who sold the property, was this the first agent or the second agent? And I'm not going to mention names. You can look those up if you want, but let me just check really quick because I'm curious. And it is the same agent. So I will say this agent is competent, and we've worked with her before, and it may not be the agent. It could easily be the seller that was very resistant to advice on things like carpet. So I'm not throwing her under the bus. I respect her professionalism, and she's well known in the community for sure. So there you have it. I don't know what occurred in this particular case, but hang on, let me find. I opened up a new cart, so I have to switch things around. So it comes back on the market under a different MLS number. So this thing, I'm not a huge fan, so it was withdrawn. Okay, let me back up. I said it was withdrawn for the entire month of August, but that was under the old MLS number.
Okay.
And a new MLS number was created, even though the old one was in withdrawn status, like 8 days later after it was withdrawn. And so there simultaneously was a withdrawn listing and a new listing. And the new listing had a much more aggressive price at 1.375. So 1.38 at the beginning of August. And then it was on the market for about a week till somebody snapped it up, and it sold for 1.3. So the last negotiated discount, 1.3 over 1.375, was 5.5% below list. But obviously a lot more from the beginning expectation of 1.5. So April's not a bad time of year to test the market, but in this particular case, they tested it for too long and kept the price too high for too long. And they probably could have addressed some of these cosmetic issues like the carpet up front.
Wonderland Hill, I know we need to move. Land value or lot value, how do they kind of slot together with like Newlands or, other North Boulder areas? Because to me, Wonderland, first, the name's a bit cooler, but also it seems to be a bit more of a mature and kind of prettier neighborhood.
That's an interesting question, and I think the answer kind of falls into what amenitizes this neighborhood. And Newlands is amenitized by access to Sanitas, and you have north-south view corridors that give you Flatiron views from a lot of houses. As soon as you walk out the door, look left or right, you're going to see the Flatirons. You're close to Ideal, and you're not too far from downtown. Wonderland is all about the open space. That the Wonderland Lake open space has jaw-dropping views. It feels very natural and scenic, and it butts right up against the foothills. It's super pretty, and you have more space typically from the neighbors between houses, so the houses are on larger lots, and they're not all grid pattern north-south. East-west. Most of Newlands is east-west. So it's a slightly different positioned neighborhood. Like, it feels totally different than Newlands. You're farther from downtown, which you might argue is a better thing. You want to be
Depends on who you are, right?
Right. Do you want to be closer or further from downtown?
Okay.
And it's not quite as accessible off of Broadway. That's the other thing about Wonderland. And I think that why that has a factor has to do with a population of people that are unhoused and go up and down Broadway. Being a little harder to get into that neighborhood makes it feel more private, makes the open space feel way more relevant. In fact, the open space is just interwoven throughout the neighborhood.
That's what I'm seeing. Yeah.
What's that?
Looking on like satellite view, that's what I'm seeing, right? It kind of comes on through, and then there's a ton of trails kind of connecting the different, almost cul-de-sacs. Yeah.
And Newlands is much higher density. It's still lovely. We have so many clients in Newlands. I'm not throwing Newlands under the bus. I love Newlands, but there's different selling points to Wonderland Lake versus Newlands.
Yeah, it's a compare contrast thing.
Right.
Huh. Okay.
Well, it's a trade-off thing.
Right.
And whether your price range is 800 to a million or your price range is 5 million up, understanding those trade-offs and having those conversations with your buyer partner, your other decision makers, maybe it's just you, but making sure you understand the trade-offs is vital to making a smart decision.
Mm-hmm.
All right, can we move on?
Yeah, let's do it.
So Orchard, all right, eventually it sold, and they took a pretty hefty discount, multiple price reductions, and eventually sold. So 1175 Bear Mountain Drive. We're going to talk about this one really quick. And basically, we don't see a ton of sales at the Bear Creek condos. So this is pretty far west. It's next to the park in Table Mesa. And Table Mesa has a couple of attached dwelling developments. This is one of the 2 or 3 that are up there. Shanahan Ridge is another one. And usually these units don't stay on the market that long. And they are very functional for people that don't want or can't afford a house and want to be in this neighborhood. Like you're in great schools, you have very low exterior maintenance. HOA dues are a little high at $700 a month. This unit did not have a garage, but it was a pretty generous 1,500 square feet total, which means it had quite a bit of that was in the basement. And it was listed, the last list price was $725. It sold at $709. Originally, it was listed at $830 in May, and they kept it on for 2 weeks before cutting the price. Smart move to cut it below $800 only 2 weeks in, but wasn't deep enough. A month later, they were cutting it to $750, and then by the end of July, down to $725 when it finally went under contract in mid-August and closed on September 19th at $709. So I guess we should do the math. So townhomes are 709 over 725 minus the 1, 2.2% below the last list price. Condos and townhomes have a ton of inventory. And a few years ago, there would have been a bidding war for this property. So I think whoever bought it benefited from selection. Mm-hmm. It's hard to find these particular types of properties. If you want Table Mesa, if you want this particular condo development.
Very cool location for some condos to be. I remember driving by these not too long ago and being surprised to see some higher density housing options in Table Mesa.
Yep.
Yeah, quite cool.
I mean, you can easily ride your bike down to the shopping center. You're in South Boulder schools. It's sort of lock and leave. And you're in a pretty nice, you're in a lovely location where there isn't going to be a lot of students, if any. And you probably young professionals are typically who buy this type of unit. The interior has a few updates, nothing particularly over the top. Looks like it might be granite and wood from the early 2000s in the kitchen. Probably granite, stainless steel, but nothing particularly, blow you away. It's just a really nice functional unit at a very reasonable price point.
Yeah, super attractive. Only thing that kills it for me is no garage.
Yeah.
I
will say, and I'm just going to speak to the marketing very directly about this, that the marketing includes language like sellers motivated, bring an offer, unit vacant, go and show. Those types of things scream lowball me, right? And at the end of the day, I don't think they...
Is that in the broker remarks?
Yeah, it doesn't particularly increase the appeal of the property. Like, you have to be really careful, even if your seller is motivated. Marketing on the seller motivation is not necessarily going to bring an offer. In fact, it can turn people off.
If it's too easy.
And we sometimes have those conversations with our sellers. Like, even if they are feeling motivated, you probably don't want to put that language in writing. Human psychology is a very important thing to understand when it comes to real estate sales.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's talk about our lovely listing that closed, 1380 Rosewood. And I helped these clients acquire the property many years ago. I can't remember what they paid for it. It doesn't really matter. And they trusted me well enough to ask me to sell it. They paid $350 for it a decade ago. And once they moved out of the unit and moved back east, they kept it as a rental. And the property itself is really, as with all of the units at Village at Uptown Broadway, the units typically feel nice, right? The finishes are better quality, and there aren't a lot of students in the neighborhood. For a few years, the library has been a pretty big overhang for sales, meaning that people were nervous about the library. But now that the library is done, I think it's totally a selling point for the neighborhood. It is so lovely, and they're doing a great job of managing security at the library. So it feels like the way libraries should feel. And it has lots of neighborhood retail. We listed the property at $599, and after a month, we cut it to $584. Arguably, and this is critical of myself, we probably should have cut it a little faster, but it really wasn't the price that was holding up the sale. We went under contract once with buyers that were not serious. I don't know how else to put it, not serious buyers. And then a more serious buyer came along and it sold for $580. So $4,000 below the list price. So $580 over $584 minus the 1. So less than 1% below list.
I was going to say, yeah.
And throughout the life of the listing, we kept track of the competition to make sure this was appropriately placed in that competitive landscape, and also tracked every single showing for feedback. We had a handyman help do some updates around the place to make it look nice, and we helped manage that process all remotely for our client. And I think they're pretty happy with the process. I called him last week. I didn't tell you this, Hamish, and to get feedback, and he said, no, you guys did a great job. Nothing critical. Really appreciated that we did all sorts of things that you wouldn't expect an agent to do, but we did because there's nobody else to do it, and we're here. And so they were very satisfied, and thanks for all your hard work on that project, Hamish.
Yeah, happy to. And it's funny too. The days on market, the buyer we ended up closing with, they were doing due diligence on the property for probably a good 2 or 3 weeks prior to us going under contract and really kind of sealing the deal. But they'd been circling, and I think our sellers went a little above and beyond, kind of getting them some due diligence docs that they were thinking about before even starting the process, and kind of just nurturing this along to a deal point. And it all really worked out.
Well, and they were very well represented. I will say that, I don't know, this is 5th, 6th deal I've done with Patrick in 20 years. Every single deal has been excellent. Patrick Dolan, naming him by name because his communication is great. His effort is sincere. He's trying to work a deal, make it happen, and solve his own buyers' objections. Particularly when he knows this is probably the best he's going to get for these buyers in this price range. Like, it's actually really nice and priced right. But sometimes buyers are reluctant. They have particular needs they want to solve for, the layout or whatever they're trying to do. And he worked really hard to try to solve those issues. And I deeply appreciate that. Very few agents, I think, work with that level of integrity at all price points for all clients. And we do.
Truly advocate, right?
Hard workers see hard workers. We acknowledge each other.
real recognize real. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, all right. I think that's it. Let's hit the news really quick, Hamish. I think, we haven't had a podcast in a long time, but I don't want to go to an hour and a half on this.
I can speed run the Carveout, my Carveout. So I think
the Carveouts are going to be more fun to talk about anyway. So let's hit the news.
Yep.
First and foremost, it's really hard to just talk about the news without acknowledging the war in the Middle East. I don't really want. It's not real estate related at all. But not saying it also feels like an omission, and the weight that has on people in this community and people around the world is real, and it's something that. Real estate. There is a real estate angle to this, and that is, real estate is an emotional thing. People buying and selling, if there's something that's weighing them down, like a national tragedy, war breaking out in another country, the shooting was the guy got sentenced, the Table Mesa shooter this week. If that happens, it basically is going to hit the pause button on new real estate transactions, because people don't feel good. There's quite a few people, especially in our community here in Boulder, and throughout the country and the world, that are heavily affected by it. So I just wanted to acknowledge it.
That's fair. And we recognize we're a real estate podcast, and however big we may be, having a platform and not saying anything kind of is the louder silence. So yeah.
We've been, I try to get news sources from both left and right. I try to pay attention to a broader spectrum of info because I feel like it's also spun. But we've been watching a little bit of Amy Goodman's reporting, and I can't watch like more than 5 minutes. It's just so emotionally upsetting because the level of depth she covers. Democracy Now!
Oh yeah, my grandparents love her. Yeah.
The videos on YouTube are just heartbreaking. I'm like, okay, unless I want to feel depressed about my life for hours, I'm not going to watch this. I can watch.
She's got that tenor to her, yeah, as well. The delivery.
Well, the people she interviews, what she cuts, I think it's legit. It's real. I don't think it's spun, but it's upsetting.
Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about real estate news.
Good news, depending on who you are.
I think it's great news for buyers and for sellers. Buyers have the best inventory. So rates were cut. The Fed announced a 50 basis point cut, and typically the 10-year and the 10-year Treasury and the 30-year fixed rate mortgage track very closely to each other, and rates are now on the downside. I need to jump off this call in a few minutes, Hamish, because I have a client call in 5 minutes. Sophie is messaging me on the side. So
okay.
We're going to cut this really fast. We saw a 25% increase in showings week over week. So last week on the news, we saw a dramatic increase. That's not our listings. That's the entire MLS in the city of Boulder. So all showings, all property types in the city of Boulder saw 25% more showings last week than the week before. And I think that's entirely driven by people realizing the rate environment's going to be dropping and people recognizing that inventory is really high and selection is fantastic. So sadly, Hamish, I don't think we can do all these carve-outs.
Not if we're going to wrap it up. Do you want to come back, or do you want to just call it a day?
Let's wrap it up with a couple of things that we're going to talk about maybe on the next podcast, okay? I would love, I've been gone for 6 weeks. I was not gone for 6 weeks at Burning Man, but 2 of those weeks were at Burning Man. I brought Starlink with me to stay in touch every day, and Hamish, you did a great job. Returning from that, you had an amazing road trip. Do you want to give a quick 30 seconds on that?
Thought it was a good idea to take a car from Colorado all the way to the coast, East Coast, Wilmington, North Carolina, and back. And during that, I also visited family and my nephews. But I learned firsthand how long a road trip can be. No issues. Real ones.
Yeah, I mean, that car
bite.
that you drove across country, heavily modified, and made it without a problem. That's fantastic. Yeah. You even did some content for somebody else's BMW channel while you were out there. That's kind of cool.
Yeah. If it's appropriate, I'll link it in the description.
Sure.
All right. Check the description.
The other things that I would love to talk more about, but I just want to. We're just out of time.
We're done.
Client meeting. Check out. I've been listening to the Acquired podcast on all of my driving around and flying around. It is so good, and there's hundreds of episodes on so many different companies, and it just dovetails with my interest in investment finance, my background in investment finance, and analyzing companies and understanding their histories, and also setting the strategic direction for this company. So that's been super interesting. And then we'll save that YouTube channel one for next time.
Sounds like a plan. Nice. Alrighty. Listener, thank you so much for joining us back after 6 weeks. We are glad to be back, and we'll be progressively less rusty as we make more podcasts. A little bit of a teaser to the next podcast, so make sure you're subscribed either on our YouTube channel or wherever you podcast, Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, the works. We're networked, we're syndicated. And if you'd like to reach out to us directly, you can find us at houseeinstein.com. We have a newsletter there. You can also sign up and get some deeper analysis and inside scoops on the market.
Thanks so much for joining us. As always, we deeply appreciate your comments, your feedback, your listening, your watching. And of course, when you pick up the phone and call us to be your realtors, we deeply appreciate that too. And we'll catch you next time.
Take care.